All right, guys, so I'm jumping on here today because a friend had recently asked me to send the birth charts for Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And when I did that and sent them and also got a chance to really sit down and look at them, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I'll put together a little video to share my insight into each of their charts. So this is just going to be a quick, 5 to 7 minute recap. Disclaimer on this video, I'm not endorsing either one of these particular people over the other. It's just simply my take on what I saw in the charts as I pulled them up. So I want to start with Bernie Sanders' chart. Bernie was born on September 8th, 1941 in New York, New York. And he is a Virgo, just like me, which I actually didn't know. I thought that was interesting. But just a couple things that jump out right away when I look at the chart. Number one is, of course, his sun being in the sign of Virgo. So thinking about someone who is pretty grounded, meticulous, detail-oriented, can be a little perfectionistic, can sometimes struggle a little bit with anxiety and overwhelm, but ultimately, someone who's also really focused on the idea of service and how they can use their gifts and talents to make the world a better place. So that is kind of a core piece of his personality based on the sun sign. His Mercury, though, interestingly, is in the next sign of Libra. And what we see with Mercury in Libra is someone who typically their thoughts are very concerned with fairness and justice. Their mental processing tends to take other people into consideration versus just kind of like thinking about the self and what's best for their own selves. And then interestingly, he has a trine between Mercury, which is in the sign of Libra, and his Uranus, which is just barely in the sign of Gemini when he was born. So having this positive kind of beneficial connection between Mercury and Uranus shows someone who is able to think outside the box, someone who's open to ideas that might seem, Uranus is tied to themes of the rebel, the revolutionary, those types of things, like really exciting, electric, in this case, ideas connecting with Mercury, and someone who's able to kind of then communicate those types of ideas and thoughts. So I thought that was fascinating too when I saw that connection in the chart. The next thing I noticed, unfortunately, we don't know his birth time, so his rising sign is something we could only guess at this point, but we know for sure that both his Mars and his moon were in the sign of Aries. So Mars being in Aries is a great thing because it's all about personal ambition and having a lot of energy and zest and chutzpah to move and work towards your goals throughout your life, and being able to throw a lot of energy into competition and other things like that. Having the moon in Aries is interesting because the moon is kind of like our emotions. So having them in a really fiery sign means that for some moon in Aries people, emotions can come on really quickly and really strongly, and they get really mad or pissed out of nowhere. But then it's like once that person moves through those emotions, sometimes they can be over as quickly as they started. So typically I sometimes think of moon in Aries as people who might seem like overreactors, or people who are reacting rather than responding. Obviously, with age and wisdom comes the ability to respond better to things versus react. But one other interesting thing I noticed about that is his Mars for sure is opposing his Venus, which is in Libra. And depending on what time he actually was born, the moon might kind of be in that opposition as well. But that kind of shows me too that there is some of a push-pull between kind of, maybe doing what's best for the group and being cooperative with people, and then also the personal agenda, the personal goals, and the things that that individual wants to move towards. So I kind of tend to look at that and say, okay, that might be an aspect that's more representative of maybe someone who doesn't always play nice with others, not play nice, but doesn't always get along well with others. And so there is some, a little bit of tension, I would say there, not something that can't be overcome. But those are the main points in his birth chart, kind of that Virgo sun, that great Mercury, Uranus aspect, the moon in Aries, and then kind of that opposition between his Mars and his Venus. So that recaps Bernie Sanders. The next candidate is, of course, Joe Biden, who was born on November 20th, 1942 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Born at approximately 8:30 a.m. Again, that's probably not the exact birth time, but that I think is the one that I saw online that most astrologers have been using. So we'll go with that. The first thing that jumped out at me about Joe Biden's chart is like heavy Pluto energy. This guy's got 4 planets in the sign of Scorpio: Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. So all those inner planets are in Scorpio, which Scorpio we know is like the most deep, intense water sign. They are this interesting mix of kind of the watery, emotional, intuitive, psychic piece, but then Scorpio being ruled by Pluto and in ancient times being connected to the planet Mars as well, shows that even though Scorpio is a water sign, like it's got this fire behind it. It's got this zing or sting, you might call it. So having that heavy Scorpio energy shows me that he is a really powerful person in and of himself, and he's probably had to deal with a lot of issues of both personal power and power of others over him or in conjunction with him. Scorpio, though, also has a great business mind. There are people who have a ton of like energy and strength and stamina, a lot of personal reserve. He has a square from Mars to his Pluto and another square from Pluto to his moon. And what that means to me, essentially, is that he's probably had to deal with a lot of deeply transformative experiences throughout his life, and probably ones that were painful or uncomfortable in some way. So again, I'm not overly familiar with the life history of either Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, so people watching this might know more than I do, but it's just interesting to me that I think he's really had to go through a lot of experiences in his life that have called him to really reach into the depths of himself and to grow and learn here in this particular lifetime. And a lot of those may have been a little bit unpleasant, but all in the name of kind of growth and change and learning about the dynamics of power and energy out in the world or personally. So yeah, that heavy Scorpio Pluto energy here. What's interesting is he has all those planets in Scorpio, but then his moon is in Taurus, the opposite sign. And moon in Taurus people can be really steady and like their emotions aren't like up, down, kind of erratic. They tend to kind of be those people who have that baseline. Moon in Taurus people can be very sentimental. They can be people who tend to hold on to things for a long time, both in a good and negative sense. So what I think is interesting about having the Scorpio and the Taurus energy, it shows that he is pretty fixed. He is someone who is probably a lot more stubborn and set in his ways than he might appear in public. But again, also then someone who kind of really has those ideals that they believe very strongly in, and it probably takes a lot for him to shift ideals or kind of what's important to him or what he thinks is right, etc. Excuse me. Last piece that kind of jumped out at me about Joe Biden's chart is, if the birth time is to be believed and is pretty accurate, that puts him as a Sagittarius rising, which would be interesting. Sag rising would give his personality some levity, some lightness. It would bring a little bit of a competitive edge, which that Scorpio energy can be very competitive as well. The Sag rising would be like someone who's a little bit more of a jokester, and they like to bring like humor into a group, and someone who is really interested in higher education, continuously learning things, someone who has a lot of like faith and optimism, just either in themselves or in life, or faith from a religious standpoint. So yeah, I think that if he truly is a Sag rising, that's probably a nice element in his chart, a nice balance, because he does not have any other fire there in the chart, besides for that Scorpio energy, which is a water energy, but is also kind of fiery in some ways too. So one last thing to point out that I think is interesting about both Joe and Bernie's charts is that their north node, which is kind of like a life path indicator in some ways, and there's a couple different indicators in the chart that I would consider a life path indicator, but they both have north node in the sign of Virgo, which shows me that in this lifetime, both of them came here to learn how to be a little bit more practical, how to find joy in the small day-to-day things, how to make service a focal point of their life and the work that they do in this life. And the more they move in that direction of service towards others, the more they're kind of fulfilling, fulfilling this calling, so to speak, that they both have there. And they both have it in that sign because they were only born a year apart. But I think it also makes sense when we look at the track record of each of them thus far. Obviously, they both entered politics, which, no comment on the present state of politics, but theoretically, it's about the idea of serving your constituents in different ways, and just the different projects that they've both been personally involved in. So I think it's interesting, and I feel like I can confidently say that both of them are fulfilling to some degree that role of North Node in Virgo. So anyway, this short take turned out to be more of like a 10 and 11 minute take versus a 5 to 7 minute take. But there are my initial thoughts on the astrology charts of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. As always, if you have any questions after you watch this video, feel free to shoot me an email, kelsey@theastroyogi.com. You can also reach out to me on Instagram, _astro_yogi. You guys have a good night.